With a single thought, the skeletal warrior sprang into action. The mage's face turned pale as his hand holding the staff trembled, immediately conjuring a shield around them. He summoned an energy shield. It was the mage's signature skill. Unlike agile archers, mages were not known for their dexterity or speed. Moreover, he is now surrounded by skeletal warriors, leaving no room for escape. As the skeletal warrior raised its blade, the energy shield contorted violently. The mage's expression changed drastically, realizing that just one strike from the skeletal warrior was enough to shatter his energy shield. He can't believe that these skeletons possessed such terrifying power. What kind of attributes did they have? He didn't have much time to contemplate, as the second skeletal warrior's blade descended. The energy shield shattered upon impact, dispersing into countless twinkling stars. Out of desperation, he used Resistant Flame Ring. The mage unleashed another skill, causing a massive ring of fire to erupt. Several nearby skeletons were instantly pushed back over 10 meters by the force of the flames. Before he could even celebrate for a moment, darkness enveloped his vision. 2 skeletons had already leaped above his head, leaving him no chance to employ any more skills. As the blades glinted, the mage's head soared into the sky. In just a span of 2 seconds, the mage met his demise. The archer, currently being pursued by the skeletal warriors, wasn't having a good time either. Witnessing the mage's death firsthand, fear filled his mind. Comparatively more agile than the mage, he continuously employed evasive skills, attempting to break free from the encirclement of the skeletal warriors. However, despite his repeated efforts, they all proved futile in the end. As the skeletal warriors closed in step by step, the space available for his maneuvers grew increasingly restricted. He didn't understand how these skeleton warriors could get so fast. Compared to the other 2, the knight seemed to be the only person who could hold his ground. The knight's body emitted a radiant glow, resembling a light bulb, as he repeatedly activated his charging skill and raced towards a distant location. This layer of light was even more resilient than the mage's energy shield, securely protecting him. Even when the skeletal warrior's blade struck his body, they were unable to inflict any harm upon him. Lin knew this was a limitless defense skill. Only a few knights could master this skill, recalling his knowledge of this skill. It was one of the knight's core abilities. Once activated, it granted an immensely powerful defense for a short period of time. The knight, relying on his limitless defense, desperately fled. A pained scream echoed from behind, and he knew that the archer had also met his demise. With both the mage and archer dead, he was thoroughly frightened. How could these skeletal warriors be so terrifying? If he had known earlier, he would not have come. It wasn't worth losing his life for a mediocre intermediate skill scroll. Lin had no intention of letting him escape. There's no turning back. He would need to ensure a clean kill. One of the skeletal warrior's blades emitted a red glow simultaneously. Rampage strike, dealing 200% of their own strength as damage to the target. The knight couldn't believe that a mere skeletal warrior would also use skills. The sword, shimmering with a red light, struck the knight. The bright white light surrounding the knight instantly dimmed significantly. Then came the second strike, followed by the third. One after another, the skeletal warriors ruthlessly unleashed their skills, rapidly diminishing the duration of the limitless defense. Moreover, more skeletal warriors had surrounded him, cutting off the knight's escape route. A sense of despair washed over him. After a dozen seconds, the knight, filled with unwillingness, was struck down by the skeletal warriors. Either don't do it at all, or if you do, don't hesitate. That's what his sister has told Lin, and that's exactly how Lin acted. Ning Yi still hadn't processed what had happened. From the beginning of the battle until the end, it took around 20 seconds. All 3 of them had been killed. Meanwhile, Lin himself hadn't even moved an inch. He simply stood there commanding his army of skeletons. The skeletal warriors had returned, carrying various items in their hands. When a person dies, the contents and items of their storage space would be dropped. The skeletal warriors had picked up everything they found. The dropped items included bronze-tier weapons, a staff, a bow, a shield, and a sword. The 4 weapons and equipment were neatly arranged in front of them. Ning Yi Yi informed him that these are all weapons obtained from the Carmen Orc Legion's dungeon. Lin was somewhat puzzled as he had never heard of this dungeon before. Noticing Lin's confusion, Ning Yi Yi continued to explain, "The Carmen Orc Legion dungeon is a level 20 dungeon located outside Shanghai City. These 4 bronze-tier equipment pieces are of no use to him, but he can sell them for some money." Without hesitation, Lin collected all 4 bronze equipment pieces, and Ning Yi Yi didn't express any objection. There were also some remaining materials, such as wolf pelts, beast bones, and green sprout grass, but the quantities were not significant. Lin also didn't hesitate and collected all of them. As long as there's value, it's worth something. After collecting the weapons, equipment, and materials, only one item remained: Beginner Skill Scroll. To his surprise, it turned out to be a beginner skill scroll, which was worth about 10,000 gold and highly valuable. Lin held the scroll and pondered whether to use it himself or sell it. Ning Yi Yi asked, "You haven't used a beginner skill scroll before, have you?" Lin nodded, confirming that he had never used one. Ning Yi Yi noticed that Lin seemed to be considering selling it. A beginner skill scroll? It's not a high-level scroll, so it's not worth much. In Ning Yi Yi's eyes, 10,000 gold coins seemed insignificant. Lin held the skill scroll and asked how to use it. Ning Yi Yi chuckled. "It's simple. Just hold the scroll and say use." Lin didn't doubt her words and followed her instructions. "Use," he said. The scroll remained motionless. Ning Yi Yi said, "Oh, wait. You know what? Your voice wasn't loud enough. You need to say use in a louder voice." Lin looked at her but didn't make a second attempt. He may not have used a skill scroll before, but he wasn't foolish. He didn't believe for a second that the volume of his voice mattered. As Lin had suspected, he figured out the method of using the scroll directly by channeling his spiritual power into it. Ning Yi Yi looked at Lin expectantly, waiting for him to shout out the word use. But Lin never uttered a word. Suddenly, the skill scroll erupted with a brilliant light enveloping Lin. Ning Yi Yi exclaimed in surprise, a disappointed look on her face. Lin found out how to properly use the scroll. She had intended to pull a prank on Lin, but he had discovered the correct method of usage. The skill scroll transformed into a sphere of light surrounding Lin, and an interface appeared. Acquired skill, Corpse Explosion. The newly acquired skill is read as follows: Corpse Explosion, Level 1, detonates a corpse, dealing damage to enemies within a 1-meter radius equal to 10% of the corpse's remaining health. Corpse Explosion is currently at Level 1. At first glance, the skill description may not seem outstanding. The range is only 1 meter, but Lin saw something different in it. This is an AoE skill. If he were to face thousands of enemies, relying on the skeleton warriors to defeat them one by one would be too slow. It would take too much time. However, with this skill, all he needs to do is kill one enemy. Then, he can detonate the corpse, causing damage to the enemies within the skill's range. As more enemies are killed and more corpses are formed, he can continue to detonate the corpses, one after another. Ning Yi Yi blinked her big eyes, her face filled with curiosity, and asked if Lin have gotten a new skill. Lin nodded. Lin didn't blame Ning Yi Yi for trying to prank him earlier. Ning Yi Yi smiled happily, complimenting Lin's voice and hoped he could talk more often. Lin looked at her. This woman seemed different from the girls in his school. She was lively and playful. "Your voice sounds nice too." Lin rarely complimented others. Ning Yi Yi appeared delighted and took out a box, placing it directly into Lin's hands. It was an intermediate skill scroll. In the exchange market, the price of an intermediate skill scroll could reach up to 1 million gold coins, 100 times the price of a beginner skill scroll. Ning Yi Yi had mentioned that the people chasing her were after this scroll. How could she just give it away like that? Ning Yi Yi sat down by the campfire and extended her hands to warm them up. With the people who were chasing her now taken care of, Ning Yi Yi felt a wave of relaxation wash over her. She had stumbled upon a stroke of luck inside the Carmen Orc Legion's camp. She found a chest that appeared randomly. By chance, Ning Yi Yi had come across it and obtained this intermediate skill scroll. Unfortunately, those few individuals had spotted her with it, leading to her being hunted down. Lin looked at Ning Yi Yi and waited for her to finish speaking before softly saying, You almost died just now. Ning Yi smiled and explained that if she received a fatal injury, she would be automatically teleported away, but she still feared pain. Well, Lin realized he had been unnecessarily worried. The girl was not an ordinary girl. She had more than enough artifacts to keep her safe, so she couldn't die. Ning Yi reached out her hand and asked if there was any food left. Lin took out several steamed buns, which he obtained from the earlier battle, totaling more than 10. Ning Yi shook her head, indicating that she didn't want anything from those people. Lin chuckled and exchanged the buns for sweet potatoes. Ning Yi happily took the sweet potato and started eating it. Watching Ning Yi savoring the food, it seemed truly delicious. Ning Yi continued her questioning, and Lin answered that he intended to go to Xinjiang Academy. In her eyes, with Lin's abilities, he would have no problem passing any academy entrance exams. Suddenly, Ning Yi thought of something and told Lin that after he arrived at Xiajing Academy, he must challenge the Divine Tower and aim for the highest floor possible. The rewards for the first-time challenge would be doubled, and it would earn him a substantial amount of points. In the academy, points were more valuable than gold. Ning Yi seemed to be quite knowledgeable about Xiajing Academy and passionately explained its details to Lin. As she spoke, Lin's mind started to form a rough image of Xiajing Academy. 99% of the time, it was Ning Yi doing the talking, and Lin simply listened, occasionally responding with a sentence or two. Eventually, Ning Yi's voice faded away and fell asleep. Lin removed his coat and offered it to Ning Yi as a makeshift blanket, while he himself began to meditate. The next day, sunlight poured in. Lin's spiritual energy was fully replenished as he woke up from his meditation. Ning Yi blinked her big eyes and looked at him. With a cheerful smile, she reached out her hand, asking for the sweet potato. Lin directly handed her a piece of sweet potato, but Ning Yi felt it wasn't enough, so Lin took out another piece. Almost all of the 20-something sweet potatoes he had brought with him were given to Ning Yi, and he didn't keep a single one for himself. Lin waved his hand and said, "There really are none left." Ning Yi smiled and said, "All right, I'll believe you." Holding the sweet potato, she bid farewell to Lin, expressing her wish to meet Lin again in the future, telling him to quickly level up so he can take her on a journey and take her along to level up. Ning Yi left swiftly, taking the sweet potatoes and the coat that served as her makeshift blanket. After Ning Yi left, Lin muttered to himself, "I'll bring you along to level up in the future." The forest was permeated with a faint smell of blood. 3 corpses lay on the ground. Lin gazed at the bodies and silently unleashed the skill he had just learned yesterday. Lin walked towards the 3 bodies and tested his newly acquired skill. Suddenly, the body exploded. With a loud bang, surrounding trees were blown to pieces. A massive pit appeared on the ground with a depth exceeding several meters. The power was quite substantial. Lin noticed that the damage range from the corpse explosion was a full 360 degrees in all directions. The body he just detonated belonged to the mage. He did a few more tests. Once again, there was a thunderous roar, even more powerful than before. Following yesterday's thoughts, Lin headed towards the Western Sea Mine. After a night of meditation, his spiritual stats was fully restored, and Lin summoned 4 more skeletal warriors. With the skill level of summoned skeletal warrior reaching level 10, the skeletal warriors transformed from black iron level to bronze level. The demand for spiritual power also increased. Now, summoning a single skeletal warrior required 70 points of spiritual stats. Lin had a total of 300 points of spiritual stats. At this point, Lin had a total of 48 skeletal warriors. Lin was already quite satisfied. He knew someday the summoning space will be maxed out, and he wasn't in a hurry. As Lin got closer to the Western Sea Mine dungeon, he started to see people gathering around. The monsters on the way to the dungeon were mostly cleared out. Soon, Lin caught sight of the entrance to the dungeon. It was a whirlpool similar to a newbie dungeon, but much larger. The whirlpool seemed to emitting a constant aura of bloodlust. At the entrance of the dungeon, many people were waving flags and shouting, searching for team members. Several people were also gathered in front of the dungeon entrance, seemingly engaged in discussion and their plans. Lin approached the entrance of the dungeon with a single skeletal warrior. He had kept the other skeletal warriors hidden, the skeletal warrior's bone friction making a sound that sent shivers down one's spine. Many people instinctively stepped back, creating a pathway for Lin. Arriving at the entrance of the dungeon, Lin checked the dungeon information. This was the real deal, and not a newbie dungeon designed for leveling up newcomers. The mine dungeon had 2 difficulty levels, offering normal and nightmare difficulties, with no hell difficulty available. Even in normal difficulty, the monsters were already elite creatures, several times stronger than those outside. The nightmare difficulty featured even stronger elite monsters, with an even higher level of difficulty. Typically, normal difficulty required a 3-person team, consisting of a tank, a damage dealer, and a support. The nightmare difficulty required a 5-person team, with dual support and dual damage dealers. From this, one could infer the difference in difficulty. The skeletal warrior stood silently beside Lin, showing no signs of movement. Finally, someone mustered the courage to use a detection spell, and it landed on both Lin and the skeletal warrior. A red light suddenly emanated from the hollow eye sockets of the skeletal warrior, directed towards the person who cast the detection spell. This startled the person, and the detection spell yielded no results, providing no information. Lin was wearing the shielding emblem given by Ning Yi. He didn't order the skeletal warrior to take action. It was just a detection spell, nothing serious. It seemed that everyone realized Lin was not an ordinary person and started inviting him to join their teams. However, Lin declined. After reviewing the dungeon information, he chose the nightmare difficulty. Lin was teleported into the dungeon. Many people were shocked to see him entering the dungeon alone. They couldn't believe that someone would dare to enter a dungeon on their own. Some people approached the person who had used the detection spell earlier, asking for details. The person seemed slightly embarrassed and said he didn't see any information. Outside the dungeon, many people wore expressions of curiosity, as there had been numerous cases where overconfident individuals attempted to solo dungeons and ended up dying inside. The Western Sea Mine dungeon lived up to its name, with the terrain inside resembling an actual mine. The dungeon was filled with a heavy, oppressive atmosphere, accompanied by a strong stench of blood. Standing within a safe zone, Lin knew that venturing outside would result in immediate attacks. Lin cast a detection spell, revealing the true nature of the elite goblin monster. Its attributes were several times higher than those of ordinary creatures. A level 14 goblin with 800 strength, 400 agility, 200 spirit, and 1000 GP. It also possessed a skill called Stunning Strike, showcasing immense strength and resilience. Even a level 14 Knight-class profession wouldn't come close to matching half of its prowess. Without proper teamwork and coordination, defeating a nightmare-level dungeon would be a daunting task. Yet when compared to Lin's skeletal warrior, the difference in attributes was still vast. Lin summoned the skeletal warrior from the summoning space, and in an instant, the room was filled with an army of skeletal warriors. Afterward, he stepped out of the safe zone, officially embarking on the journey through the dungeon. The goblin guard roared in excitement and charged at Lin, only to be met with the skeletal warrior's large axe. It was quickly dispatched with a few strikes, and Lin received a notification. You have slain a level 14 goblin guard and gained 4,200 experience. A tinge of excitement flashed through Lin's mind. The experience gained was about 10 times higher than that of monsters at the same level. Killing a single monster here was equivalent to killing 10 outside. Lin felt that he had found the right direction and immediately issued a command. The skeletal warriors swiftly rushed into the dungeon corridor with a clattering sound. Like an unstoppable army, they slaughtered their way through, and messages kept appearing. The screen was filled with rapid notifications, not only gaining experience, but also obtaining numerous items and materials. Experience began to increase rapidly, and the number of materials kept growing. A detailed map of the dungeon quickly formed in Lin's mind. The mine dungeon was exactly as its name suggested, a mine. Inside, there were many passages, interconnected in various directions. Just 5 minutes after entering the dungeon, a radiant light of leveling up appeared on Lin. He reached level 11, and upon leveling up, his spirit was fully restored. Lin immediately summoned 4 more skeletal warriors. He checked his own attributes and noticed that the increase in basic attributes had become more significant, with each level granting a boost of 20 attribute points instead of the previous 10. His spirit had also increased by 100 points. Lin understood that as his level increased, the subsequent attribute boosts would become even greater. This realization came to him after reviewing his attributes. The 4 attributes of the skeletal warriors had reached a terrifying 1700, and this overall change was within his expectations. However, the recently acquired corpse explosion skill remained at level 1 without any changes. Lin felt puzzled as to why the Soul Flame and Summon Skeletal Warrior skills had both improved, but the corpse explosion skill remained the same. He couldn't understand why. If Ning Yi were here, perhaps she would know. Lin thought of Ning Yi, the adorable girl who loved pranks and could talk endlessly. Her knowledge surpassed his own by a considerable margin. Setting aside the doubts in his mind for now, he continued moving deeper into the dungeon. Suddenly, a massive creature blocked the path. A giant wolf king appeared before Lin, and the detection spell revealed it to be the Mine Wolf King, an elite boss with surprisingly high attributes. Lin encountered a boss-level monster for the first time, and it was an elite boss at that. Surprisingly, its 4 attributes were even higher than those of a skeletal warrior. Such a degree of strength was expected in a nightmare difficulty dungeon. The crimson eyes of the Wolf King locked onto Lin, emanating a bloodthirsty aura. However, in the end, it was just a wolf. Lin gave the command to attack, and the skeletal warriors swiftly charged towards the Mine Wolf King. The Mine Wolf King let out a fierce roar, unleashing its skills. A powerful shockwave erupted from its mouth. The leading skeletal warrior was sent flying by the impact. The remaining skeletal warriors who were unaffected by the shockwave used their skills, delivering rampage strikes. The skeletal warriors who hadn't been knocked back had already reached the Mine Wolf King and began slashing at it with their glowing red blades. The Wolf King howled in agony. Many skeletal warriors leaped high into the air, landing directly on the Wolf King's body and activating their skills with red glows. This scene closely resembled what Lin had witnessed during the day of his class transition. The skeletal warriors also had slain the mighty dragon in such a manner. The Mining Wolf King went into a frenzy, rolling and repeatedly crashing its massive body against the rocky walls of the mine, attempting to shake off the skeletal warriors clinging to it. It unleashed its roar skill once again, sending the surrounding skeletal warriors flying. This time, it used all its strength, maximizing the impact of the knockback effect. Suddenly, the Mine Wolf King turned around and limped towards the passage. Lin was slightly taken aback, as he hadn't expected the dungeon boss to flee. The Mine Wolf King ran into the passage, howling all the way. Something seemed off about the situation. Feeling that something was amiss, Lin didn't order the skeletal warriors to pursue. Instead, he had them retreat to his side. The iron doors on both sides of the passage swung open amidst the Mine Wolf King's howls, and bloodthirsty wolves emerged from behind the doors. Under the detection spell, the attributes of these wolves were revealed. Level 14, blood wolves with 600 strength, 600 agility, 200 spirit, and 1,000 health. Although the individual attributes of the blood wolves were not particularly strong, their sheer numbers, totaling at least 100, were enough to send chills down one's spine. However, Lin was not afraid. Despite the large number of mine blood wolves, their attributes were not high, and his skeletal warriors were more than capable of dealing with them. With a single strike, a skeletal warrior easily sliced one of the wolves, granting Lin both experience and wolf skins. A graceful smile formed on Lin's lips, and a radiant glow appeared in the palm of his hand. Corpse explosion! With a deafening roar, the bodies of the mine blood wolves were detonated. Not a single wolf could withstand the amplified damage that was 5 times more powerful. Instant kill. Undoubtedly, it was an instant kill. In an instant, Notifications flooded the screen. Within the blink of an eye, Lin's experience skyrocketed from 32% to 72%. At that moment, the Mine Wolf King hobbled back, its eyes filled with terror. Conveniently, there were several Blood Wolf corpses at its feet. Lin's gaze turned cold, and a faint light flickered in his palm. Corpse explosion. Boom! 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 3 consecutive explosions simultaneously engulfed the 3 corpses. Screams resounded, and the Wolf King let out a final lament. After a few staggering movements, its massive body crashed to the ground. Lin gained 15,000 experience, as well as the Wolf King's fangs and low-level monster crystals. Lin continued down the winding passage, encountering a number of goblin-like monsters along the way. With a sweeping gesture, the skeletal army charged into the mine pit. Faced with the onslaught of skeletal warriors like a tide, these enhanced elite monsters were powerless to resist. One after another, they were slain. Although the enhanced elite monsters were formidable, they also offered generous experience and abundant materials. Lin pondered that in the future, when he could solo in hell-level dungeons, the experience gained would likely be even greater. Continuing along the passage, Lin cleared out the monsters along the way. With a few rounds of nightmare difficulty, it wouldn't be a difficult task to reach level 16, or even levels 18 or 19. Lin knew he is one step closer to seeing his sister. Thought of Lin Mohan made Lin smile, a rare sight indeed. The final boss of the mine dungeon sat in the center of the mine, its massive mouth continuously inhaling and exhaling air. The sound of its breath was like thunder, reverberating through the vast mine cavern. This boss seemed completely unaware of the events happening outside. It appeared to be asleep. Lin cast a detection spell, revealing the Goblin King, a boss-level monster at level 16. Its strength and HP reached an astonishing 3,000, and it possessed 3 skills. This final boss, with significantly higher attributes than the skeletal warriors, was awakened by the detection spell. It slowly opened its eyes and locked its gaze onto Lin. Then, with a roar, it leaped into the air, wielding a giant cleaver and bringing it down towards Lin's head. The cleaver carried a terrifying gust of wind as it descended. Lin attempted to dodge backward but still got hit. His passive skill triggered, transferring the damage, and Lin furrowed his brow. He felt the skeletal warriors had all been injured, their bones displaying fine cracks. Shockingly, 2 of the skeletal warriors were obliterated, turning to dust. He quickly retreated while the remaining skeletal warriors rushed in front of him, protecting him. Rampage strike! The skeletal warriors unleashed their skills, launching powerful attacks that inflicted immense damage upon the Goblin King. Lin stepped aside, contemplating what had just happened. The effect of damage transfer was to transfer the damage he received to his summoned creatures. All summoned creatures would share the damage equally. It suddenly became clear to him. The reason why the skeletal warriors were simultaneously injured and suffered significant damage from the previous attack was mainly because his own attributes were too weak. His base HP and defense attribute was too low. Facing the Goblin King with 3,000 strength, the damage he received would be immense. The transferred damage was based on his own attributes, disregarding the skeletal warrior's defense. All of that damage was then transferred to the skeletal warriors, resulting in their injuries. He shook his head. Although the skeletal warriors were strong, he was their only weakness. If they faced a powerful enemy who decided to abandon engaging with the skeletal warriors and instead focused on continuously attacking Lin, he would be in danger as well. Damage transfer was not invincible. Now that he knew his weakness, Lin naturally sought ways to compensate for it. While a single skeletal warrior couldn't contend with the Goblin King's overwhelming strength, he had an entire legion at his disposal. He proceeded to summon several new skeletal warriors to join the battle.